Or to put it differently, how they can avoid falling into what Graham Allison has called the Thucydides trap, the trap in which a rising power clashes inevitably with an incumbent power. The term that Kissinger's used repeatedly to argue for a harmonious future is co-evolution. And co-evolution is the theme I'd like to conclude my remarks with this evening, partly because it seems to me that's exactly what we're engaged in right here at Schwarzman College. This is an experiment, a kind of hybrid institution at the heart of the revered campus of Tsinghua University, but an institution which has many Western characteristics, including, I'm glad to say, a functioning alcohol-serving bar. And in that celebratory spirit, I'd like to conclude with a celebration of the interaction of civilizations, a celebration of the fact that not only has China learned a great deal from Western ideas and institutions in the last 30 years, but also that we in the West, slowly, admittedly, are learning from the East. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, professors, for your great metaphors from this round. We are now ready to move to questions from the audience. My colleagues Emma and David are ready. So Emma, what's the most interesting question you found?
We have already grouped the questions that a lot of people submit are similar. We, according to our own interest or according to the timeline they submitted. Our first question is from Dan J.R. from Schwarzman College and Roger Wang from the Tsinghua community. The question is related to the new killer app in the 21st century. Professors, you agree that the rest of the day are using these same killer apps to close the gap. Can the reconvergence really happen on the backs of the same 6 killer apps 4 centuries later? What will be the new killer apps for the world next phase or in the 21st century? Thank you.
Professor Ferguson, would you like to address that?
I've spent a lot of time asking myself, did I miss one? Or was one superfluous? And I've had many arguments with readers. Some have come up to me and said, but you missed out democracy. And I say that was deliberate. Because you can't claim that the great divergence happened because of democracy. Democracy came so late to the game in all Western societies, long after the great divergence had occurred. What about Christianity, some people say to me. It's often in the Midwest. And I say, I have bad news. Because Christianity can't really have been the secret sauce. Think of all that protracted period after the fall of the Roman Empire when absolutely nothing happened in Western Europe, despite the benefits of Christianity. Maybe the Protestant Reformation could be part of the story, but I tried to argue in the book that that in itself isn't the key. You have to understand something Max Weber didn't quite get, the way the Reformation encouraged literacy. And it was the literacy that really mattered in those parts of Europe that turned to Luther and Calvin's teachings. So I stick with the 6 killer apps because I think they are both necessary and sufficient. Let me illustrate this with a simple point. When I come to Beijing and I talk to influential people here, the question that comes up time and again is a question about the rule of law, about property rights. Ask, why is there capital outflow from China? And the answer will come from somewhere because of insecurity of property rights. It is, I think, recognized by many Chinese intellectuals that one of the fundamental challenges that China faces in the coming years is how far it can transition to a really functioning rule of law based on private property rights. That's one of my killer apps, and a critical feature of China's predicament in the 21st century is that it has downloaded some of the killer apps, most of them, but not that one. And until it does, I think it will be in that middle income trap that so many economists have written about.
Professor Acharya, what's your reaction to that?
Yes, I do have a view on this. First of all, I don't like anything that starts with killer. So killer apps, I know it's a fashionable term, but But I think we will have new instruments, maybe savior apps. To me, the most important thing that's going to help the world to move to a new globalism is what I call global interdependence, which is why the facility stuff will not happen, which is why the decline of the United States, relative decline, will still not lead to the return to the sort of a European style First, Second World War multipolarity. And today, this is something that is not part of Professor Ferguson's 6 killer apps. He talks about important things, and I think that medicine and consumer society and scientific revolution, he doesn't talk about interdependence. And there's a good reason for it. There was no real global interdependence in the, until now. The Europe had interdependence. The rest of the world was dependent on Europe because of colonialism. So I come back to my point. Like a broken record. But today, interdependence is truly global. Look at the G20. Who are the members of G20? The country in the southern tip of South America, Brazil, the country in the southern tip of Africa, South Africa, the southern tip of Asia, Indonesia, then India, China, Middle East, you have Turkey and Saudi Arabia, then Europe, of course, United States, Canada. Why this G20 came together? Because of a global financial crisis. That's an indicator. That's the bad side of global interdependence. But the good side is that it mattered. The G20 mattered, at least in rescuing the world at that point. So that's why the United States and China are unlikely to go to war. Not because they necessarily love each other, but because they have this mutual or sheer destruction kind of a situation in terms of finance. Now, to me, that is the new app, or savior app, not killer app.
Thank you so much. The next round of questions. I'm sure you can get more provocative than this.
All right, we're going to turn to a question from Kest, one of our Schwartzman scholars. He said, if you compare China and India, two countries that have similar size and population and both went through independence movements around the same time, what are the killer apps that have enabled China to jump ahead? Are they different than those which allowed the West to push forward over the East?
Professor Ferguson, would you like to start?
I was in Delhi about 8 or 9 years ago, and I gave a speech which rather surprised my hosts, in which I compared China and India to the hare and the tortoise in the famous fable. I said, you seem to lag behind now, but like the tortoise in the fable, you will win the race. At that time, nobody took me seriously when I argued that India's growth rate would overtake that of China. But that has subsequently happened. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is obviously a demographic story. There was no one-child policy in India. But there's another which I think is profoundly important. The legacy of British rule, which has often been maligned and is still maligned by some opportunistic Indian politicians, was far from all bad for India. Because India inherited from the Raj a functioning legal system. Slowly functioning, but functioning nonetheless. It inherited the possibility of representative government based on democracy. And it inherited, I think, perhaps most importantly, a free press. I think those are vital institutional advantages when a country is trying to make the leap from middle income to upper income. Of course, nobody can possibly disparage the extraordinary achievement that China's leaders pulled off in the period after 1978. It was a phenomenal achievement that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But the problem China faces now is that it has created the world's biggest middle class, but it doesn't have the institutions that go with a bourgeois society. The institutions that allow some representation, the institutions that allow the protection of private property rights, and the institutions that allow accountability of politicians like a free press. So that seems to me to be the fundamental difference. And I think it will be why, when one looks ahead 10 or 20 years, it will look like India, that is the hare, to the Chinese tortoise.
I didn't want to get into an India-China comparison for family reasons. Part of my family is Chinese. But I must agree with Professor Ferguson here. I mean, that's basically my own view. And there is one thing that I have noticed since I come to China, and this is the longest I've actually lived in China. People think democracy for India is kind of a luxury, and it's an ideology. And India can live without it. India can have a Mao if it wants to, and that's the way to go. We had a debate on this recently. My answer to that, for India, democracy is not a luxury, it's a necessity. India will break apart, fall apart without democracy. It's a way of conflict resolution. And giving space to a very diverse society, where, vociferous society, where democracy gives a stake in the political system. Now, that's all I can say. India and China are different societies culturally. Each has its own way of progressing. And by the way, not everything is different. There are a lot of similarities between India and China. For example, last year in an opinion poll, 80% of Chinese and 77% of Indians thought globalization is a good thing. And they're both optimistic about the future. In both countries, it's a Pew survey, that in both societies, people thought their countries are doing better than their children's. Their children will do better than what they are doing now, their parents doing now. So I think there's, and also there are a lot of common ground, a lot of similarities in worldviews and approaches to world order, some differences which we want to minimize. But I think it's possible for a world to accommodate two different types of political systems. We could have, I wrote an op-ed once that there is enough room under the sun for both China and India. And I think India and China have been around for 2,000 years, and they have fought only one war. I mean, they have a bilateral relationship going back to 2,000 years. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, the relationship is complementary, not competitive, at least in Southeast Asia. So I think India and China will not converge in terms of political systems. They might converge more on economically. And I don't see that, they are fundamentally hostile to each other. But I do agree with Professor Ferguson of the problems he characterized about China's problem, 15, 20 years, in the medium term, if not in the short term.
Thank you so much. David?
Kind of like a follow-up to the question we just talked about. Professor Ferguson, you didn't answer our question because we were asking why China leaped forward so far, not whether China's going to still leap forward in the future. And quoting from Teddy Cohen from our Schwarzen College and Monish Ke Daijun, they said that maybe the state capitalism and political meritocracy may be China's killer app. And when you look at the Japan's polarization and hierarchical state intervention in the market, and Singapore's sublimitation of individual rights to collective economic welfare, it seems that the Adam Smith school of thought didn't apply to their miracle of growth. How would you two professors address this problem? Thank you.
Well, it's of course a fascinating question how to explain China's phenomenal growth after 1978. But I'm very skeptical of the argument that state capitalism is the answer. The most dynamic parts of the Chinese economy have always been those where the market forces have been given the most free play. And the great transformation came about because that entrepreneurial and competitive instinct that had not been stamped out in the years of Chairman Mao was given free rein in the town and village enterprises and the special economic zones and so forth. It is still the case that the most dynamic parts of the Chinese economy are not the state-owned enterprises, but the new and extraordinary technology companies that have sprung up in recent years. I've been taught the importance of the acronym BAT. Where I come from, that stands for Border Adjustment Tax, but I now know it has a different significance here. The most impressive thing about China's economic takeoff is precisely that the state has reduced its role. And the most dynamic cities, I think here of Wenzhou, are places which seem like the most free market cities on the planet. The problems that China confronts have much more to do with the persistence of a large state sector. I think particularly of the problems of overcapacity in heavy industry. The excess savings of the state-owned enterprises are one of the fundamental reasons why China's consumption has been slow to grow. So there are these structural obstacles that are really a legacy of the excessively large role that the state played in China's economy. For me, the story of China's success can be told very simply. China downloaded the killer app marked competition. Its economy became ferociously competitive in many, though not all, sectors. And that is really the heart of the matter. If it had just been a matter of state capitalism, I think the Chinese would have run into exactly the problems that the Russians ran into in the 1980s. You can't reform the state capitalist system. What you have to do is gradually replace it with a market economy, and I think is what has happened in China.
Thank you. Professor Acharya?
Nothing much to add except that I don't like monocausal explanations, that one thing like state capitalism explains all this. The story is more complex. I'm not an economist, but I think I won't call it state capitalism, but maybe a partnership between state and business, state-guided business. So another way to put this is that, yes, China did download a killer app, but when they downloaded it, they made some changes. And maybe in the process of downloading, they introduced a couple of elements. And this is what I have been writing about in my theory on ideas, that ideas are never adopted. They're almost always adapted or localized. So obviously, what happened in China is the global economy helped. In a sense, the liberal order did help China. But at the same time, the Chinese did not completely mimic it and accepted everything. They also had to look at their own political system, domestic political system, and also the domestic economic structure, prior experience, to actually introduce some, well, you know, the Chinese characteristics. And I think that doesn't make it a model or state capitalism, but it's certainly not the same killer app that others have downloaded. So I do believe that capitalism has variations. American capitalism is a little different from European capitalism. East Asia has its own capitalism. And there are similarities, but also there are special characteristics that are unique to each place where the app is being downloaded.
Thank you. This is our last question. Please make it memorable. Because otherwise we'll have to think of a good ending.
This is from Lucas Berger from Schwartzman College. The question today is, what would a failure in relations between the U.S. and China look like? What are the most important areas for the U.S. and China to understand one another, and should either change to accommodate this?
Professor Chair, would you like to start?
Well, now this is a topic that has been discussed about 3 million times since I've been in Schwartzman College. So to answer it very, very briefly, I think the biggest area of cooperation, common interest, is actually finance. And you know what Jack Liu was talking about. There's a lot of common interest between the U.S. and China. I would think global climate change is another area of commonality. Now, geopolitical competition is not going to go away. But I don't think this idea of a Thucydides trap makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, one of the problems of realism is that when confronted with an anomaly, realists will go back. So they sometimes say Asia's future will be Europe's past. And then they say Asia's future will be Greek's past. So Thucydides trap. I think the world in the 21st century is fundamentally different from those periods. And I think the US and China have a lot of common interests when the chips are down. I don't see this as a cooperation among countries which are like-minded or share all the values, but they have enough pragmatism and enough of a belief that if they don't cooperate as the two, the most important relationship in the world, that both are going to lose. And that's also the dynamic of interdependence that I talked about. So I can go on about South China Sea, East China Sea, South Korea, THAAD, Japan. But I actually think that if North Korean situation becomes out of hand and North Korea does some antics, China and US will cooperate in actually managing the crisis. So I am an optimist, and I see that China and the United States both will cooperate and compete, but I don't see they will compete in a way that will lead us to some sort of a Thucydides trap.
Thank you so much. Professor Ferguson?
Well, let me take you back in time. Let me take you back to 1971, when a man named Henry Kissinger went on a secret mission to this city, at a time when China was essentially closed off to the rest of the world, in the grip of the Cultural Revolution, economically a rounding error, maybe 3% of GDP. Kissinger's secret mission to China was the beginning of one of the most amazing stories of modern times. The resumption of relations between the United States and China. It began in the 1970s. And ever since then, we've seen that reconvergence that I began by talking about. It started then. It started with Nixon in China, that extraordinary moment when one of the great Cold Warrior presidents came to communist China and shook hands with Chairman Mao. Fast forward to our own time, and you have to kind of pinch yourself that in such a short space of time, in less than my lifetime, China has gone from being an economic nothing to being the second largest economy in the world, and the relationship between the United States and China is now the most important bilateral relationship on the planet. We all, I think, have reasons to be apprehensive because of things that President Trump and some of his advisors have said on the campaign trail and more recently. I believe that nothing would be more disastrous for the world than for the United States and China to end up in a trade war with one another. And I very much hope that will not happen. I think it would be calamitous if some of the reckless language that has been used in Washington with respect to the South China Sea led to naval friction, even a clash between the two. These are dangerous times. People must feel uneasy that this relationship could be destabilized. But I want to end on a positive note, because I think things have improved markedly in just the space of a few weeks. And with Secretary of State Tillerson on his way to Beijing, you must be aware that something very extraordinary is in the offing. And that is that President Xi is going to be paying a visit to President Trump in the place that he refers to as the Southern White House. So we've gone from Nixon in China to Xi at Mar-a-Lago. And on that happy note, I invite you all to join us in the Schwartzman Bar to drink to co-evolution and our harmonious relationship between Western and Eastern civilizations. Thanks very much.
So Professor Acharya wants to have the last word on this one.
Winston Churchill once said that there's one thing that has saved more lives and minds of British colonial officials than doctors. You know what that is? It's a bottle of gin. So, this is the real killer app. That is what saved the British Empire from collapse.
And you know you've won the argument when the Indian quotes Churchill.
So I invite Professor Ferguson to join me. join me in having a drink.
So everyone, what happened here stays here. Don't mention the clothes removal, the gin, the whatever. Congratulations, everyone, for making it so far in a Friday evening. Thank you, professors. It's been a privilege. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
That's great. Would you mind sending this book for me? I bought it last time I came for
Oh, why not?
yeah, I bought it last time.
And this one?
Yeah, it's good. Please. Remember what? Thank you. So that's your pen. Thank you.
Okay.